Now, let's talk about moral uncertainty. Um, Great. 7 minutes in. Let's start. So this is a dope open access book, Moral Uncertainty. The link's in the description. Um, William McCaskill, I don't know how to say this name, Christer Bickvist, and Toby Ord. I only know the first and last two because I'm one of those annoying effective altruism people. But William McCaskill wrote his whole PhD dissertation on normative uncertainty. And so I don't know the exact relationship between that and this book, but I assume there's a pretty close connection. The point was to defend a certain view of moral uncertainty called maximizing expected choiceworthiness. And this book, the goal is to do that. Um, and yeah, so I've been reading through it and it's open access, so that's really cool. Appreciate that. Love when that happens. Um, and just to, yes, I'm uncertain of the connection. That is correct. Um, I have much uncertainty in many things. So this class that I'm taking, I shared the syllabus on Twitter the other day. But it was basically going through this whole book and then reading like one extra paper each week. And I figured I'm going to be reading this stuff anyway, and I like making knowledge publicly available. So I figured I might as well stream and talk about this stuff to the uh, maybe zero point 0.5 other people who are interested. So yeah, this week is about a certain voting paradox, and then thinking about choosing moral theories on like a voting type approach. And I have no idea how exactly this would work. But one of the issues with using any type of voting type of approach is that there's certain paradoxes that arise because voting in certain ways can be irrational. Um, so you have to do it pretty carefully. So the goal of this book, first, it's to say why we need to actually care about moral uncertainty. So I guess the very first thing is there such thing as moral uncertainty that goes over and above and beyond empirical uncertainty? Or is there, like, if you have all of the descriptive facts, is it just kind of straightforward? Are all cases of moral uncertainty, are they just kind of reducible to, well, I just don't know what would happen if I did this, and then therefore I'm uncertain about what to do just because I don't know the empirical facts. But if you get rid of all of that type of uncertainty, we just have, I don't know which moral theory is correct. It seems like there's something over and above empirical uncertainty that is left over. And then apparently there's like 5 or 6 objections that people make to even caring about moral uncertainty. So they have like these different objections, like fetishism, that it's not like the right thing to care about. Of course, they'd pick some weird way to phrase it like that. They're like caring about the wrong thing. There's an infinite regress. Oh, I'm uncertain about my uncertainty, etc. And then, yeah, various objections. And yeah, of course, like I do think we should take moral uncertainty very seriously, and you know, we have to kind of deal with the fact that, okay, yeah, consequentialism is correct, but not like 100% certain consequentialism is correct. Divine glory consequentialism, of course, that's the correct view. So what do I do with that? How do I kind of take action on that basis? Do I need to account for other theories? Maybe I should just go with my theory I'm most confident in. So that's my favorite theory approach to moral uncertainty. But there is some problems here, so that was kind of the next chapter. The very first thing to kind of set out um, their approach, their preferred approach, maximizing expected choiceworthiness. Their very first task was to basically attack the my favorite theory view, because Well, it'd be nice and easy if, I could just say, well, I'm most confident in consequentialism or divine command theory or whatever, and then I'm just going to do what it says and then call it a day. But there are some issues with that potentially. So they go through and they mention a couple of fixable issues. I guess the definition is just they define the relevant thing we're looking for is an appropriate action. Option equals action. So we're looking for appropriate actions where appropriate in this case is like kind of the right thing to do in the face of uncertainty. And they didn't want to use other words like rational or what's obligatory or whatever to kind of cash out or to kind of designate moral uncertainty as its own unique thing. Maybe I'll make this a little bigger. Uh, so some action A is appropriate if and only if it's permissible according to the theory that the person has the highest credence in. So that's the my favorite theory approach. And then there's different like, you know, kind of problems that it faces. But you might end up with if you have two theories that you're equally confident in, and you're both the most confident, let's say you just have two theories and you're 50-50 exactly, and everything else you assign a credence 0. Well, under this view, that means that like on one day I could be acting as a deontologist, on the next day I could be acting as a utilitarian and just flip-flop constantly. And they give an example, if you choose, instead of choosing between like moral theories, you might be choosing between kind of like more specific cases like pro-life or pro-choice. Then maybe one day, if I have equal credence in both, I'm just 50-50 in the most extreme cases, then one day it's appropriate for me to like sabotage an abortion clinic. And then the very next day, I, punish myself for doing so, or commit some like, you know, radical, whatever. I just go and like voluntarily back alley perform abortions for people, you know, if I'm 50-50 split. Okay, so that seems really stupid. And then, yeah, and then there's some other technical things that we might want to fix. So in order to do that, you have to like make this account a little bit more complicated, and it looks really scary in the final version. So this is the final account, and it's annoying analytic philosophy, but the short version is it solves the problem. So that's great. Okay, cool. But now there's a bigger problem, which is how do I pick or like how do I split up all the different theories? There's a bunch of different theories. So there's a problem here when it comes to theory individuation. I guess the thing that I think that McCaskill and co. don't really appreciate here is that this is just like a really deep fundamental problem for like everything. Just trying to come up with credences in theories in the first place in every area of philosophy. In philosophy of science, there's a huge problem of theory individuation and how the heck you split up your theories. Um, and of course, it's hard to know what confidence level you should have in what if you don't know even like which theories you should even have distinct credences in. And it's a very general problem. So here's just a very simple example. Let's say I have some deontology, for example, I have 40% confident in, utilitarianism, 60% confident. And I'm considering between two actions, A and B, and they're kind of opposite in this case. Well, according to my favorite theory, I just go with the action that's the most confident. I have the greatest confidence level, so I do action A because that's permissible. So that's the thing I should do according to my favorite theory. The problem is, well, that's not the only way to understand utilitarianism. There's more than one way. So let's say that I split up my theory into two ways. I mean, maybe I could just count it as like a, you know, okay, hedonistic utilitarianism or preference utilitarianism. Or I guess I should pick the two more plausible preference utilitarianism and then like an objectivist theory for well-being, something like that, whatever. So now I have two versions of utilitarianism. Let's say I'm 50-50 between those, and then deontology is still the original third option. Well, now there's a problem because my favorite theory is now deontology, even though I still have like a 60% credence that action A is the permissible one. According to my favorite theory, I should now do action B because my best theory with the highest credence is now 40% deontology. So I should do action B. And that seems like there's a problem if I can just split up theories in different ways. And then they propose, the main people defending my favorite theory today in this Gustafsson and Tortman paper, they have a certain prescription for how you individuate theories. And it turns out that that's just really not a good way to do it. Yeah, the short version is that doesn't solve the problem. And so they have their own preferred approach is maximizing expected choiceworthiness. The reason why you might want something like maximizing expected choiceworthiness is because you might have a case like this. You might have a case where you have some theory, T1, and you're just slightly more confident, 51%. And then you have some other theory, T2, that's slightly less confident. And then you're considering between two actions. And on the slightly more confident theory, it's permissible, but it's really, really bad on the slightly less confident theory. And then the other option is it's just barely wrong. It's just a little bit bad for the one you're slightly more confident in, and then it's totally fine for the slightly less confident. So intuitively, you end up with um, saying that it is like intuitively we should prefer action B in this case. So we should prefer that uh, there's like a slightly wrong here, but it's permissible here, but you avoid doing some grave wrong. You avoid doing something really bad if you um, do option B. You're kind of guaranteed to avoid it. Okay, so that's kind of why we might have maximizing expected choiceworthiness, or at least the point is that we at least need to consider how bad things are in addition to what our credences are in the theory in order to make a decision as what's appropriate in the face of uncertainty. Okay, so that's kind of where we've been so far in this book, and that makes some pretty good sense to me. I hope we can try to salvage my favorite theory, but I am less confident than I was. But I will figure that out more later. So what we're after today is an approach that has to do with basically taking votes with respect to certain moral theories. And I've kind of yet to see exactly how this works. So I don't know how it will work, but one thing I do know is that for context, we're learning about some voting paradoxes. So there's a certain voting paradox that arises. It's called Arrow's Impossibility Theorem. And the idea is kind of a generalization of another paradox. So this is Condorcet. So let me just move this over. Whoops, I wasn't supposed to click that. a Condorcet paradox. Let's see. So it's errors and possibility theorem. And yeah, basically you end up with acting irrational. Yes, there we go. So Condorcet's paradox. And I don't know how to pronounce any of these things. So you end up with issues. So majority rule is inherently self-contradictory. It's logically impossible for a voting system to guarantee that the winner will have support from the majority of voters. So you can always get a case where the majority of voters, you end up with a cycle. So you can always end up with a case where the majority of voters will have preferences. So if you consider three candidates, they prefer A to B and B to C, and then also prefer C to A. And so even if every individual is consistent, collectively they're inconsistent. So you end up with this paradox. So, and then the problem is not just for majority rule, it's actually for any voting rule. And that is that is what errors and possibility theorem is. So we need to basically, if we're going to try to rely on some social choice analogy for deciding what moral theory we should go with, then we probably should figure out how to deal with some paradoxes. But so first, I'm just going to dive into the paradoxes first. And this is where I've never done this before on stream, and I'm actually just going to be reading this because I need to read this. And I'm not going to be reading this out loud. But yeah, so where we're going to start now is the error and possibility theorem. Where do we go from here? So majority rule is irrational, it seems, in certain ways. And this is also linked in the description. You can download a version of this paper. And I'm going to read it now, and comment as I go, I guess. And we'll see how this goes. But yeah, okay, cool. All right. I'm literally just going to be reading this. But anyway, okay. So Amartya Sen, nice Nobel art in economics, right? Okay. There we go. So as a result, this of errors and possibility theorem says there is no good election method. Okay, that's not a good conclusion. So I hope we can get out of this. I hope so. I assume that it would be a pretty bad thing if we are all committed to collective irrationality, if there's no rational way of electing people. I'm not sure what else we can do with that, though. Is democracy really better if it's an irrational approach? But I guess it's no more rational. I'm not sure. Then what? Dictatorship? I don't know. Okay, so we're considering a voting rule. So we have some ballot with some candidates, and we need to pick a method. And presumably this should be based on how voters rank the candidates. So usually this is plurality rule. So whoever is the voter's favorite candidate, aka gets more votes, then they should be elected. If you have three candidates, 40% like X, 35% like Y, 25% like Z, then X should win because that's the biggest percentage. That makes sense. You have plurality gets the winner. That's how we do senators and representatives in the US. It's called first past the post. Those Brits, their silly names. All right, we have simple majority rule. Yeah, so Condorcet's paradox. Okay. So if we just consider, so the paradox comes from when we just consider two candidates at a time. So if I just consider the first two candidates, X and Y, 40% put X greater than Y, 35, yeah, okay. Then Z. Okay, so here you are including all three at first, based on these rankings. Okay, right. Right, so, okay, 40% put X, then Y, then Z. 35% Y, then Z, then X. So this is first, second, third. And then 25% Z, then Y, then X. So higher is better here, based on these rankings. Rankings, Y is the winner. Right, that makes sense. So 35% say Y is the best. Right. Then we have 40% Y is second. Right, so you can see X is greater than Y, but Y is greater than X in 35% of the cases, and Y is also greater than X in 25% of the cases. And then Y is greater than Z in 40%, and then also in 35%, so it's greater in 75% of the cases. So when you look at the pairwise, Y is greater than the other two cases the majority of the time. So Y wins the plurality. That makes sense. Okay. Because the majority rule chooses Y. Did I understand that correctly? Did I understand that correctly? The majority of winner is candidate Y. The majority prefer Y to X and the majority prefer Y to Z. Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah. So then the point is just the plurality put X is greater than Y, greater than Z. So as the first. But if you just look piecewise, then Y wins. So that makes sense. So I'm pretty sure that should say X is the plurality winner, because they clearly say plurality rule favors X, majority favors Y. But okay, what do I know? So which one's better, plurality or majority here? And then maybe we need to consider a bunch of other rules. Cool. So what do we want out of a voting rule? We need to figure out what axioms. So we have a set of axioms. Each of them would be great, but their combination is impossible. Not a good sign. There's too many cases like this in population ethics. It's a nightmare. Too many impossibility theorems in population ethics, and now we have one for democracy being irrational. That's no good at all. Okay. Yeah, well, you do need only one winner because somebody has to get elected. So this axiom makes sense. Have a Pareto principle. If every single one votes one candidate above another, then we should not elect the person who everyone voted was not as good as another candidate. That makes a lot of sense. Non-dictatorship. No voter should have the power to always get their way. I don't know why that would ever be a possibility. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure why it would ever be possible for a voter to always get his way, but I mean, that makes sense. I don't know how that would play into it. Okay, yeah. So this one is a big deal. Independence of irrelevant alternatives. So obviously if you, and I guess like it's kind of intuitive. Right. So if you add some third candidate to the presidential election and they kind of siphon votes away from the main two, it's one way of thinking about it or looking at it. But there's a famous kind of counterexample, at least as a very general principle. Um, Ew, why am I? Presumably it's in here somewhere. Social choice. Right. So for example, oh, dang it. So for example, I mean, it's really just considered if you have like if there's a case where uniqueness matters or rarity matters, then your alternatives do actually matter. They're not irrelevant. So he gives an example where consider to take an apple out of a basket, and how many options there are do matter. So if there's only one apple, then like many people would not take it to avoid being greedy, to leave it for the next person, something like that. But if if there's like seven apples, then you wouldn't do that. And you might see something similar if there's like three different cookies available, and one's macadamia nut and chocolate chip and oatmeal raisin or whatever, um, and there's like one of each, or there's two snickerdoodles and one chocolate chip. Uh, you might prefer the snickerdoodle to leave options open for other people, and even if you would prefer the chocolate to the snickerdoodle, like all else equal. So this is a case where in individual choices, like the candidates do actually matter, but that's only if something like uniqueness has some type of value or rarity has like value over and above. But presumably this is in moral theories like should not be the case. That should not be something that ends up being relevant. There's not like a uniqueness or rarity value that comes with a theory being one of just a couple of choices, or being different than the others. That's not a reason to prefer one moral theory to another. So that means that this axiom is more plausible on like a moral uncertainty view than otherwise. Okay. than just like a general principle, right? So yeah, if we consider the same kind of ballot but add an additional candidate who is not going to win, that shouldn't make a difference. So this independence axiom is that the candidate would still win even if you add someone who loses. Adding someone who's guaranteed to lose shouldn't change the outcome, but it sometimes clearly does. And that seems like it's not a good thing, right? So in the 2000 election, everything mattered for Florida. Oh yeah, right. Bush only just got a few hundred votes. More than Gore. What the heck's a hanging Chad? Is that a term? That's bizarre. Incomplete ballot papers from incorrectly punched voting cards. Okay, interesting. I did not know that term. Yeah, Ralph Nader, 1,000 people voted for. So it does actually make a difference. Okay, so here's a spoiler this term for something that does make an irrelevant candidate did make a difference. And that doesn't seem democratic. That makes sense. So you have this independence axiom to rule out people who don't win shouldn't make a difference. X beats each majority. Yeah, so if a candidate's winning against other candidates, then if somebody's dropped who isn't going to win, then it shouldn't make a difference. Majority rule doesn't always produce a clear-cut winner. So I guess that's the difference between majority rule versus plurality rule. Okay, consider an election with 3 candidates, X, Y, and Z. Dictating which 35% have XYZ, 33% YZX, 32% ZXY. All right. Y beats Z by a majority. So Y is greater than Z, 35% plus 33%, 68%. And then X beats Y by a majority. So X beats Y in 35% of cases plus 32%. So that's 67%. And then Z beats X by a majority. So Z is greater than X in 33% plus 32% is 65%. Okay. So there is no candidate that beats each of the other two. So when you just do this piecewise comparison, then there's no clear winner. Okay, that is interesting. He wasn't aware of the paradox initially. Blah, blah, blah. His first thoughts. So Arrow rediscovered the paradox. Interesting. Thought it was, he called it well known. All right. No, I guess it was not. Okay, so majority rule violates decisiveness, plurality rule violates independence. Well, that's not good. We're just trying to satisfy 4 axioms. Surely it's not that difficult. Okay, well, so we cannot get decisiveness, consensus / Pareto optimality, non-dictatorship, and independence. Okay, so non-dictatorship is not too demanding. Okay, so yeah, if two voters are sufficient to decide every election, then that's technically a non-dictatorship, but probably not very democratic. So yeah, we probably want an even stronger treatment than just a single voter not being able to decide. We need equal treatment. So I guess this is really a 5th axiom. Well, it's just strengthening the non-dictatorship. Really. Okay. Yes, equal treatment of candidates. Candidates should get special privilege. Right, so obviously if we make an impossibility theorem for a certain set of axioms, if we make the axioms even more strengthened, more specific, more demanding, then obviously that rules out even more cases. So these are compelling axioms. Okay. He wants to give us hope. So maybe voters' rankings can turn out in practice in ways that are consistent with the axioms. Let's see. So Ralph Nader was probably not ranked first. There's a good reason why the rankings. So Bush is better than Nader, is greater than Gore, is rare. And that's because Nader was the left-wing candidate. Gore was somewhere in between Nader and Bush. So if you liked Bush's policies, you likely did not like Nader's at all. Okay, so if we can rule that out, if we rule out those specific rankings, which are unlikely anyway because of the position that these candidates are likely to be in, where one is in the middle of the other, then you don't get a paradox. Okay, well, that's a good sign. When you rule out certain rankings. Okay. So if you restrict rankings, candidate rankings by voters to be certain plausible ways, then you do get some consistency. Okay, with the axioms. That's good. Okay, right. So then the idea is we have found a case where it can satisfy the axioms like in a given reasonable restrictions. maybe some voting rules satisfy the axioms in a majority of cases, okay? I don't know what this is. Maybe this is Arrow's book. Okay, so he's going to propose a voting rule that works for a certain restricted class of rankings. I don't really know theoretically and generally what these two rankings really represent. So I guess I need to think about it some more, but I'll just keep reading. So there's a domination theorem. Okay, take any voting rule that's different than majority rule. And let's say that it satisfies. It works well, I'm assuming means satisfies the axioms. The majority rule does as well. Or there must be some other class. Okay, I don't know that this is helpful at all. Must be some other class of rankings for which majority rule works well. But I guess, I mean, it's just saying, oh, okay. Okay, it's just saying majority rule is dope. Okay, okay. So majority rule is better, is at least as good as every other option. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's a good sign for majority rule then. Okay. Assuming that they're sincere, I would hope so. Many voting systems, strategic voting, ranking a strategic voting. Okay. So sometimes it may be strategic for you to vote against your preferences. Well, that sounds pretty fair. Okay, add an additional axiom. The domination theorem still works. The majority rule is still the best, even if you add this additional axiom. Strategy proofness. So voters, or it's in their interest to vote sincerely. So okay, I don't understand the naming convention, but cool. Okay. Sure. I noted before. Okay, so majority rule is the best that we can do. That's a weird ending place. Cool. This paragraph just seems like a bonus little side note. Okay, cool. So it turns out majority rule dominates other voting rules and is pretty reasonable as long as voters aren't stupid, I guess, in their rankings. I don't really know. Yeah, I guess I still need to think about this. What exactly this represents. Something about one of them being an intermediate between the other two. I'm not really sure. But okay, cool. So majority rule isn't too bad. It's at least better. What are those sayings like democracy's whatever? It's like the least terrible option. Yep, that makes sense. Okay, cool. So that's just validation of that common saying. Cool. So now that is supposed to be an analogy to what McCaskill and co. are doing, um, or want to do. They want to try to apply something like that to choosing a moral theory. So, social choice analogy, social choice theory is how do you aggregate individual preferences for some social choice or judgment, whether that's a voting or something like that. You have a single choice that has to be decided by aggregating a bunch of individual preferences. That's social choice. And specifically, he wants to apply this to ordinal theories, aka, oh yeah, I guess the idea is in some theories um, you can compare them, and in some theories it's hard to compare. There we go. So comparability conditions, when we're trying to compare between theories, moral theories, and we're trying to look at how bad is some action on some theory relative to how bad it is on some other theory. There's different levels of comparability that they might be able to have, and how comparable they are depends in part on kind of like what level of information each theory can tell you about different, how good or bad certain actions are. And that's called measurability. Let's see, there is a definition somewhere, but yeah, but the point is, in this case, we're looking at where it's just ordinal scale comparability in this chapter, chapter 3. And ordinal scale just means you can prefer one theory to another. You can say, okay, well, I think utilitarianism is more likely than deontology, but I can't say, yeah, let's see, is this what he's saying? I think that's right. Actually, ordinal scale is really four theories that can only say this action is better than some action, better than some action, better than some other action. There we go. So that's just an ordinal scale. I can say this action better than this action, better than this action, better than this action, but I can't say this action is twice as good as this action, which is 3 times as good as this action. That would be a ratio scale measurability. So we need something fancy schmancy to try to deal with this like very limited kind of theory that gives us only a little bit of information, just a ranking. And plausibly, like Kantianism, for example, is just a ranking. This is better than this one, but I can't say this is like 3 times as bad to do, to lie rather than to let someone die or to kill them or whatever. And that's in a footnote here coming up. But okay. This is probably going to be way too technically and annoying for people, so that this is really just for me, but that is okay. So we want to potentially see if we can use this analogy with social choice and hopefully not get stuck in voting paradoxes to try to choose between moral theories. And I don't really know how exactly he hopes to do this. So anyway, let's just get through this. Okay. Yeah, so choiceworthiness is just about how much reason you have to do some act. And what if your theory doesn't tell you, you know, this is like 5 times worse than this other theory. It's not clear what to do. Right, so some theories just say one is worse, but the difference between murder and lying doesn't say anything about how much worse that is than like just lying versus telling the truth. So that's just what's considered an ordinal theory. So you can't apply maximizing expected choiceworthiness because, yeah, that requires like a sufficiently information dense theory to be able to tell you that. Okay. All right, so there's a problem of intertheoretic comparisons. If it's wrong to kill one person to save 50, utilitarian says that it's not wrong. Which theory is there more at stake? Because I think that's a pretty common way to make, I think, contractualist reasoning or like even deontological reasoning is like, who has more claim here? So in this case, it's like, which theory has more claim on you if you do the wrong decision? Which one of these is worse? So some people just say, okay, well, clearly we can't even do this whole project. Or that could be a reason to just prefer my favorite theory, right? Because you don't have to deal with theoretic comparisons. If you just say, well, I should just do what my most confident theory says, then okay, cool. Like, I don't need to compare with any other theory. I just live by my theory, which is definitely a perk of my favorite theory. Okay, let's see. So then they're going to try to develop this analogy. How this can apply. So maybe we should do my favorite theory. And then my favorite option just says you should do the most likely action. So even if like your favorite theory and your next 5 favorite theories might differ, but if you're just considering 2 actions, like one action might be very well dominated by like the vast majority of the theories that you have sufficient credence in. So, which is a pretty reasonable option. Then this Borda rule, I have seen the name and I have no idea what that means. So let's see. Okay, yeah, cool. I don't really know what's going on. So if you want to do a expected choiceworthiness, you need 2 conditions. You need to have interval scale, which is like yeah, I mean, it's like anything that can have a positive linear transformation, ax plus b, but so like temperature, for example, is an interval scale. So you can convert Celsius to Fahrenheit using a transformation that's some function ax plus b. So in this case, it's 1.8x plus 32 to go from Celsius to Fahrenheit. So that's an interval scale. And then, yeah, a ratio scale would be like mass, kilograms versus pounds. Right, so this is a stuff I've already mentioned. So if you have some theory, you're trying to decide between doing A and B, what's the difference in your choiceworthiness, how much reason you have, how can we compare that between 2 actions on some other theory? So we need something like that. So many theories do supply that, but okay, utilitarianism, because utility satisfies certain axioms. at least to get a good definition of utility, satisfies like a set of axioms. There's a couple different ways of specifying it. Let's see. I forget which ones they are. Fun. Yeah, you have Savage's set of theorems, and then you have whatever they are. Von Neumann, is that one? Anyway, doesn't matter. So, anyway, as long as, yeah, you have some set of credences that satisfy certain axioms, then you can get an interval scale for utility, which is interesting because there's not a unique 0 point, which for utilitarianism, you kind of need to know if something's like positive or negative. I mean, technically you don't, but like intuitively, it seems like there is a positive and negative. But anyway, okay. Right, so yeah, that doesn't really matter, I don't think. Yeah, so sometimes you expected utility theory conflicts with common sense intuition, so you end up with a paradox. And yeah, I would get into that, but I don't think that's necessary. And so it does seem like it's okay to violate these axioms like this in this paradox. So let's see, do I have... So here's the, I don't know how to pronounce this paradox in the decision theory Stanford Encyclopedia. If you have two different lotteries here, crap, lost it. Yeah. So let's say you have 100 different tickets into some lottery, and it's an equal chance for each lottery. So this is one lottery, and you have to choose which one of these would you prefer, one or two. So this is like basically roughly a 2/3 chance of getting $2,400 and a 1/3 chance roughly of getting 2,500, or and then a 1% chance of getting $0 or a guaranteed $2,400. So basically 2/3 2,400, 1/3 2,500 with some rounding, and then 0% or a 1% chance of 0 or guaranteed 2,400. And so a lot of people like guaranteed, with the guaranteed amount, 2,400. That makes sense. I actually kind of like this. It's less obvious to me in this case. The example that I've seen is more like you kind of increase this by a huge amount, where it's like 5,000 or 10,000. Then it's clear that I definitely would want lottery one. But then the issue is we come down to this next set of lotteries, and now we no longer have the guaranteed 2,400. So, but we still, anyway, the point is that it's very common to have an inconsistent preference, at least inconsistent in terms of inconsistent with expected utility theory. So many people prefer the guaranteed 2,400 over this one, but then they prefer the one that's not guaranteed over the guarantee in this case. Well, I say it's not guaranteed. I just mean, anyway, it's still a difference in one ticket here, right? So then this is a violation of the principle of irrelevant alternatives. So that conflicts with the independence axiom. Okay, I actually have the expected value intuitions here that are consistent, but I can understand why people do not. So that's the Elias paradox. That's probably saying that totally wrong. Anyway, okay. So plausibly Kant's an ethical theory that is only ordinally measurable and not you can't do these types of comparisons where murder is like 5 times as bad as lying. Like plausibly, that makes sense. Which is apparently equivalent to saying essentially, so it violates continuity for sure. Um, and that's apparently, yeah, so that's basically saying that you can make these types of like cross-action comparisons so that you can like kind of gamble on actions a little bit, which I think there's always going to be some probability that you'd prefer, um, yeah, like certain preferences of actions, whatever. And I think this requires a certain like aggregation of risk, I suspect, and I definitely want to not have that. I think we need to bound aggregation in a certain way. Um, like the famous shrimp welfare case, for example, the the saving 10 to the 100 shrimp over a human. Her example. Let's see. Yes, usage save 10 to the 100 shrimp over one human. I disagree. Uh, so let's look at the Skittles case. So is it permissible for you to drive to the store to get some Skittles, even when there's some minuscule risk that someone will die as a result? And intuitively, that seems correct, right? And so basically, you make this kind of inference to, okay, well, you just scale that up not arbitrarily, but you ratio it to whatever risk you're willing to take. You just basically scale that up hugely. So you end up with it being like equivalent, according to this kind of axiom, right? But I think we should reject this like aggregation of risk. And I would like to explore that more in the future, but not right now. So it's unclear like how much worse lying is than murder, or vice versa in Kant's theory. Lying is worse than telling the truth. Murder is worse than um, not killing anyone, right? But is murder worse than lying? Might be unclear, right? So even within the theory, it's hard to compare wrongness of actions, much less trying to compare how wrong something is in Kantianism versus utilitarianism. Okay, I think they've established this point well enough. Okay, apparently it hasn't even been discussed. I guess because everyone's a utilitarian in the literature. So it's been maybe just assumed you go with my favorite theory or my favorite option. And so if we can't make these comparisons, that would be really bad. So then we just can't decide what to do. hedging. Let's see, where is this from? Okay, let's see. Under the two units must be incomparable. Okay, sure. Oh yeah, so that's just, this is like the one defender of my favorite theory. Yeah, so he just thinks that intertheoretic comparison is impossible. And then, so we should just go with my favorite theory. Cool. So maybe you can use different criteria depending on your information. Okay, so we're going to use social choice. So we're going to try to aggregate individual preferences into a single social function for choice. Okay. Okay, so then, so that's how they do it. So maybe you just sum all the utility over all individuals, or maybe you just look at the worst off member, so that's max and min. Maybe you do a lexical version of that. So you look at, make sure the worst off is as good as possible. And then you look at the second worst off, make sure they're as good as possible, etc. So that's the lexical version of maximin, leximin. And then you have maximax, maximize the best off. And then leximax, maximize the second best off, etc. Okay, so this is just, we need to, instead of aggregating individual preferences, we aggregate different theories' choiceworthiness function into a single appropriateness ordering. So which one of these is appropriate? Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Instead of individuals, we have theories. Instead of preferences, we have choiceworthiness, how much reason you have for some action. Okay, so it replaces individuals with moral theories. Utility functions with a choiceworthiness function. Social welfare. Our goal is not social welfare here. We're trying to decide. We're doing decision making with moral uncertainty. And then instead of using a utilitarian function, we have the maximizing expected choiceworthiness function. All right. Yeah, so social choice theorists like utilitarianism, they like maximize expected choiceworthiness. Choice. So there's competing preferences. We have to compromise because people have different preferences. So we need the best compromise when there's competing moral theories with competing recommendations. Okay, I don't know anything about social choice theory. Haven't gotten to that chapter in my decision theory book. Okay, so maybe we need to vary measurability. So that was about the difference between if you can have purely ranking of actions, or we can say how much worse actions are. And then there's different comparability, looking at intertheoretic comparisons, interpersonal comparisons. So you have interpersonal comparisons of utility. Oh, okay. So voting theory is social choice theory, specifically when you can't compare preferences and the preferences are just ordinally measurable. So when you vote, you don't say how much more do you like this candidate than this other candidate. You just say, do you prefer this candidate to candidate A to candidate B? Okay, so that makes sense. So no wonder he's doing a voting analogy. Okay, so that actually makes some sense. First theories and like individuals don't count the same. Right. So you just weight based on the credence. So that's straightforward enough. That makes perfect sense. More important, this analogy. Social choice. Okay, I don't know exactly what this means. Okay, yeah, so some of the theories will be measurable and comparable in different ways. So it'll be interval scale measurable. Right. Ah, okay. So that's assumption that's broken, is that some theories give us different amounts of information, but in voting, all of the voters are kind of equal in the information that they provide about their preferences, how detailed we can get. Right, so it's important to be able to weight how bad something is versus your credence in that theory. Okay. So why don't we just want to go with our favorite theory in this kind of case? Julia is a judge. Okay. So should we give a verdict of guilty to someone we are confidently innocent? And we might be able to avoid a riot, or at least put it off if we call for a retrial. Okay, so utilitarianism would say, okay, sure. So, okay, fine. This is just a stipulated example. So, okay, utilitarianism says, yeah, just say he's guilty to pacify the crowd. That's better than calling for a retrial, which is better than saying he's innocent because it will cause the deaths of several people, which is really bad. Sure. Okay, just barely less than that. Common sense morality would say, okay, call for a retrial. and then declare them innocent, basically next time around. And that way you're much less likely to have a riot. Okay, like that makes sense. But then deontological would just say no, like you need to just declare them innocent. Doesn't matter, or not that it doesn't matter, but ultimately it's okay that the riot happens and people die as a result because you're doing the right thing or whatever. Okay, cool. So in this case, my favorite theory and my favorite option both say option A is most appropriate. But that does seem wrong, right? Like, yeah, whatever. Seems like B is correct. The correct answer. Just call for a retrial. But that's just because I have the highest confidence in something like this. So is this an informative thought experiment? I'm not sure. Let's see. Slightly lower probability. Yes, it does. My favorite option. Let's see. Yeah, my favorite option would say A. Yeah, okay. Right. Okay, so if it's not the best, then these two are totally insensitive to it. Okay, so yeah, that is rejecting relevant information. So that makes sense to me. So we probably do need to include something about, yeah, I guess like how bad these are, stuff like that. Okay, so let's go back to the voting paradoxes. We need to do something about the paradox. I'm not familiar with this. Yeah, okay, that's complicated. Don't know anything about voting stuff, so okay. So let's think about all possible pairs. How candidates are in a head-to-head with every other candidate. If you look at all pairwise candidates, if you look at all candidates pairwise, if the majority prefer one to the other, one specific one for every other option, then that one should be elected. So that makes sense. Okay, bringing that into the moral uncertainty case of picking a moral theory. So A beats B if and only if, in a pairwise comparison. Okay, this maker thinks it's more likely, sorry, it is more likely that A is more trustworthy than B is more trustworthy than A. And then you can do that for all possible pairs of actions. Okay, that makes sense. So we're comparing choiceworthiness, which is, again, what you have most reason to do according to that theory. Look at all possible pairs of actions. And then an action is a winner if it beats every other action, every other candidate action. Okay, so that makes sense. Okay, so then let's look back at our table and make sure that makes sense. So, okay, how would this work? B beats both A and C. Okay, so 31% plus 34% has B greater than A, right? So B is greater than A, according to 31 plus 34% is 65%. I'm going to make a note of that. So 65% B greater than A. Okay, now look about B compared to C. So 35% comes from utilitarianism, and then 34% from common sense morality. So we have a 69% chance that B is greater than C. So that means, given we only had three options, A, B, or C, calling an innocent person guilty, calling for a retrial to decrease the chance of a riot later, or calling them innocent, resulting in a riot and the deaths of several people. So that seems really bad. But okay, so so it seems like, according to the same voting rules we kind of talked about earlier, B is greater than both of the other options in the majority rule. So 69% chance, 69% of our credence has B is greater than the other one, and 65% is B is greater than A. Okay, so it looks like B is the best option based on this theory, based on this approach, this pairwise comparison. Okay, that's great. What if you don't have such a Condorcet winner? All right, let's talk about Jason. Morally relevant. Is that how hiring managers think? That they're like, what's the most morally relevant features of this candidate? I'm not so sure about that. Oh man. It's a nightmare of picking between these candidates. Pick your favorite minority. Okay, so some virtue says single mother, better than the privileged person, better than young black male. 30, non-consequentialism, just choose in accordance with the qualification. So strong CV, better than poor background, better than single mother. Then greatest confidence in consequentialism. And the poor dude, poor young dude, that's the best one. Okay. So then that's no good. So B beats C in 60%. So B is better than C. What about A? B is greater than A in just 30%. So A beats B 70% of the time. What seems right here? I don't really know. I mean, it's not like I have intuitions about this. Do you have any intuitions about? I mean, probably just, I mean, of course, I'm the privileged white guy saying that maybe B makes the most sense, but you know, I don't know. Let's see. So I have the highest credence that C is the best. Okay, I don't know. So C wins out with the highest credence. Man, this gets complicated. Okay, the difference in the credence. So you have to actually not just look at the total credence, but actually the difference in the credences. Okay, okay. So you have to look at how bad the defeat is. Okay, I mean, that does make sense. So how much? Okay, yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So you look at the biggest pairwise defeat. Okay. C is only, so the magnitude of defeat is 7, so it's 70 minus 30 is 40% and 20%. So that tells you that C is the most appropriate option. Okay, that sounds pretty fair once again. So you have, whoops. So you have credence and theories. You look pairwise. How does C compare to A? How does C compare to B? And look at which one is defeated the least bad. Cool. Okay, but we have to deal with how do we split up our theories? I think is just as bad as a problem for choice worthiness analysis than as it is for like my favorite theory. It's just a problem for everyone. You have to be able to individuate theories, which is really hard. Credences. Credences change. Well, that's no good. Should often change. Should they? I mean, obviously I learn new evidence, or I gather more evidence. Think of more thought experiments, read more papers, whatever, and I update. Like, okay, given still gathering evidence, like, sure, I guess they should change, but okay. But like, if I have a good theory of theory individuation, and I have like studied this stuff enough, like stable credences seems pretty fine, but presumably we have to deal with updating over time, I guess. Uh, I don't know why we can't just like use the current, if I'm trying to make a decision at time t, I just base that decision based on my credences at time t. I don't know what's the problem with that. Like, yeah, I'm obviously going to be inconsistent over time if I change my credences. That seems kind of fine, assuming I'm updating appropriately, but whatever. Additional voter. All right. Okay, if you just add another voter who's basically the same, that shouldn't make the outcome worse. Okay. Right, so if you update to make a theory more likely, then right. So if you have some action that's preferred on some theory, if you have some action A that's preferred to B on some theory, then if you become more confident in that theory, then you should not, then it is only at least as appropriate to choose that option in light of uncertainty. I mean, yeah, that seems pretty obvious. Cool. Yeah, I mean, right. That does seem obvious. First, how highly ranked the option is. So appropriateness should be considered by only two things: how highly ranked the option is. This is kind of important. Second, how much credence is. Okay, yeah, I mean that's the same as like their usual approach. You need to combine credence with like how bad something is. So it's ranking plus credence. Right. Oh, what? No, that's not good. That's not good at all. So if you apply that approach we just did, fascinating. So if you use that decision-making procedure that we just went through that violates that condition, dang, how did he, oh, implies the no-show paradox. Okay. Guess somebody found that already. What is that citing? Fascinating. Okay. Jane is a military commander who wants to aid a distant town, but you have to go through enemy territory. Option one, blow up a bunch of stuff. Okay. Killing some enemy civilians. Bomb a factory, killing enemy engineers who help soldiers. 90 for soldiers. So it also kills 10 of her own soldiers, I guess because the enemy engineers help. Okay. So then 25 of her soldiers, 25 of the other soldiers die in option C. Then option D, load up, help her soldiers survive, and none of the enemy soldiers survive. Gosh, so then you have to rank this according to theories. Man, this is very non-trivial. Gosh. Minimize the number of deaths. That sounds pretty good. Minimize the number of deaths. Is still killing 10 civilians. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. Maybe you should just care about your own soldiers more. Oh my gosh. This is a lot to keep track of. 5 different theories. I'm getting very tired. Okay. Option D is the best, according to this, which is killing all the soldiers. And 5 of hers lose. Yes, it is highly complicated, and we have no intuitions. What's certain is that gaining credence in one's theory should not have the consequence of making that option worse. But that's what happens. Okay, I'm just gonna trust it. I might work this algebra out off stream, but yeah. Okay. The ratios and her credences. So once you update, then you increase your credence in the theory, but you have now made an action that was not preferred by the theory that you updated on. You've made it worse off. Okay. So it's been shown that apparently any of those pairwise comparisons will violate that condition. That's another unfortunate. Why are there so many paradoxes? It's so hard to be rational. Man, it really is very difficult. There's a loaf of bread. Time to violate another axiom of decision theory. Okay, so Condorcet extensions are out, but they seem good enough, honestly. I just want a viable method of picking moral theories, man. Why is this so difficult? So they're immune to voting against your own preferences. Well, that's nice, I guess. So you can't really lie about your preferences to bring about a better outcome than if you were just honest about your preferences. Okay, cool. Well, that's good. This consideration doesn't help at all in moral uncertainty. Okay, well, never mind then. Yeah. Yeah, what does that even mean for a theory to lie about its choiceworthiness? Well, yeah, so clearly that's not very helpful. That's yeah, okay. So that's not helpful. All right, so maybe now we have a better option, the Borda rule. All right, how much longer do we have here? All right, not too much longer. That's good. Borda rule. Okay, man, this has been a roller coaster. Very emotional. Okay. So again, comparing in a round robin head-to-head tournament, all pairwise comparisons. You look at the magnitude of the defeat and victory. Yeah, cool. But rather than focusing on the size of the biggest pairwise defeat, okay. the Borda rule. Okay, looks at your pairwise victories, and you sum the magnitude of pairwise victories. Okay, hey, focusing on victory over defeat. That's good. I like this. It's more positive. So you sum the total magnitude of the victories. Okay, cool. That actually sounds pretty reasonable. So you have a round robin tennis tournament. Player A wins, but it has to win during a tiebreaker every single time. And then player B just barely loses, but with all of his other sets, completely demolished them. So Condorcet extensions would say player A wins, but Borda rule would say that player B wins. So if you have to play a tiebreaker every single time, and then player B just like demolishes everyone else, and then happens to lose to you, I don't know, you probably should play again. But besides that, yeah, I'd probably prefer player B. Yeah, I mean, it's true. Both have something going for them. But the fact that it's not obvious. Okay, right. So that just means that it's not obvious that these Condorcet extensions are just like wildly better. Okay, good. But Borda rule does sound pretty nice. Like, yeah. Okay. Okay, this seems like it's might be subject not to theory individuation problems, but like just how many options you might consider. But I don't know if you're trying to decide between hopefully like somewhat plausible options. So, because if you're just adding super bad options to the mix, presumably any plausible moral theory was all going to rank all of those at the bottom. So they would like cancel out. Okay. Number of options less choice worthy than some action. Minus the ones that are more choice worthy. Okay, sure. So just where is it in the list? You do how much to the bottom minus what's above. Okay. And then you multiply by the theories. Okay. By the theory's credence, by your credence in the theory. Cool. Yeah, I mean, not a really helpful definition because we need to know what a credence weighted Borda score is, but that's okay. It's not just this function. Okay, consider the judge case. So hopefully the judge case gets it right. Or it gets the judge case right. Which I think this makes sense. Right. I'm not going to worry about this. Hiring decision. Right. Okay. This seems like the correct answer. Cool. Tactical decisions with the military. Before updating, you get A, B, D, C. And then he says we don't have any intuitions. Okay, I agree. Heck if I know. But once we increase our credence in T5, expect this. substantial increase. Yes, and that's what we find. Okay, so it's A, then B, then B, then C. Oh, that's the exact opposite, right? A, B, no, it's A, B, D, C. Yeah, that's the exact opposite of the Borda rule prior to updating. And then once we update, then we've now changed. So A is then replaced by D. B, they didn't say how much. Oh, you don't need this. Oh, it presumably does the same update as before. Okay. C, then A. Oh, wow. That's a big difference. A was first, and now it's last. That must have been a big update. Okay. Okay, so that does make sense. So this Borda rule allows you to update your credences and retain like which choice is preferred by that theory. Great. Yeah, so appealing to cases is limited because you don't know if those cases are representative, and maybe there's a bunch you haven't thought of. So this is actually like a really important point, a general question when it comes to appealing to thought experiments. So if we just have general properties, that's a good approach. Updating consistency is a good property. So Borda rule is better than these Condorcet extensions. In voting theory, only scoring rules. And claims you should maximize the sum. Okay, so the Borda rule is a scoring rule. Whereas Simpson-Kramer is not. Okay. But we already rejected MFO. Cool. So we can add in the score of each speech. Another intuitively obvious. The score of each option in some position. Yeah, sure. Whatever. Math. Okay, why do you need to axiomatize Borda rule? If for all pairs of options. Yes. If for all pairs, it's equally likely and all options are equally appropriate. Okay, yes. The only scoring function. Wow. Okay, so Borda rule actually seems pretty good. That doesn't make intuitive sense. Okay. All right. One might question cancellation. You have a 50% credence ABC, 50% credence in C is better than B is better than A. So maybe B is the best. Even though according to cancellation, they're all equally appropriate. So that's basically like a risk aversion principle, whereas the Borda rule is risk neutral. And then they just said, well, risk neutral is better. Okay, well, I don't really like that response. That's very unsatisfactory. I like risk aversion. Risk aversion is good. Okay, well, everything up until this point, pretty plausible. I'm a little bit hesitant about this risk part, this risk neutrality. I'm curious about what risk-averse versions of Borda rule have been applied. That would be very difficult to apply, or at least it's not obvious. I'm sure people have come up with something, but this seems a little bit difficult. Okay, so this is a way to deal with ordinal rankings. Wow. Even if you just have ordinal rankings, then you can take it into account with the Borda rule. That's actually pretty cool. I'm pretty impressed by this approach. So, great. Nice. Borda rule seems pretty good. All right. Well, that is what I plan to talk about today. Less than 2 hours. That's good. Um, so if this wasn't horrendously boring enough, actually, I'm gonna go back. How do I go back to this? Okay. Maybe next week, if another more than 0 people are ever interested, I might talk about this. That's next, right? Yeah, I've heard about this. The principle of equity among moral theories. Should we consider them kind of like give them the same, kind of ranking, all else equal? How does that work with credence? I don't know. So yeah, we'll see. But this was my stream today on moral uncertainty. Hopefully you learned something and didn't hate it too much. Slightly bit of a slog, but pretty interesting stuff. So join me in the future if you wish. I might do this again. Um, let me know in the comments if it wasn't too horrible. Thanks and gig 'em. Okay, gig 'em.